Hey there, welcome to Respirex. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you get too cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's story takes us to a small town called Millbrook, a place where nothing much ever happened. The biggest news in Millbrook was usually the annual Harvest Festival or who won the high school football game. But that all changed on a cold October night when a night clerk at the Riverside Motel received a phone call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The clerk's name was Daniel Price. He had been working the late shift at the Riverside Motel for nearly 6 years. It was a quiet job, mostly consisting of checking in tire truck drivers and the occasional traveler passing through on the state highway. Nothing ever happened in Millbrook after dark. The streets were empty, the stores were closed, and the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. But on that night, at exactly 11:42 p.m., the phone rang. Daniel glanced at the caller ID. Room 309. He picked up the phone, his voice calm and professional. Front desk. How can I help you? For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, slow and deliberate, as if someone was standing on the other end of the line, waiting. Daniel frowned. Hello, room 309. A woman's voice finally spoke, soft and trembling. Please help me. Daniel sat up straight, his heart beginning to race. What's wrong? What's happening? More breathing, then a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. Daniel's stomach tightened. Are you okay? What's going on? The woman whispered again, her voice shaking with fear. He said he'd come back. Daniel's mind started racing. Who? Who's coming back? For a second, the line went quiet. Then the woman said something that would later become one of the most chilling lines ever recorded in the Millbrook police files. If the phone goes dead, it means he's here. Then the line went silent, but it didn't disconnect. For almost 2 full minutes, Daniel sat frozen, listening to nothing but the faint sound of the motel room's television playing in the background. He could hear the low murmur of a late-night talk show, the distant sound of a car passing by outside, and then nothing. And then, click, the call ended. Daniel stared at the phone, his hands trembling. Something felt terribly wrong. Very wrong. Every instinct told him to call the police, to wait for backup, to stay safe. But something else, something deeper, told him he had to go. He had to check on room 309. So he grabbed the master key from the hook behind the desk and started walking toward the hallway. The Riverside Motel hallway was quiet, too quiet. The flickering lights buzzed softly above him, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The air smelled of old cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning products. Daniel's footsteps echoed as he walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached room 309. The television was still playing inside. He could hear it through the door, the faint sound of a late-night commercial, cheerful and completely out of place. But there was no other sound. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Daniel knocked on the door. Front desk. Is everything okay? No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Hello. Room 309. Still nothing. Daniel's hand trembled as he slid the master key into the lock. The door clicked open, and he pushed it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw inside would trigger one of the most disturbing investigations the town of Millbrook had ever seen. The room was empty, completely empty. The bed was perfectly made, the covers smooth and undisturbed. The lights were off, except for the glow of the television. The curtains were drawn. The air was still and cold, but the phone on the nightstand was off the hook. Daniel stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Hello, is anyone here? No answer. Then he noticed something. The bathroom door. It was slightly open, just a crack. And beneath it, something dark was spreading across the tile floor. At first, Daniel's brain refused to process what he was seeing. It was just a shadow, he told himself. Just a trick of the light. But as he stepped closer, his stomach dropped. It was blood. A thin red line was slowly crawling across the white tile, pooling in the grout lines, spreading like a dark stain. Daniel staggered backward, his hand flying to his mouth. He turned and ran, not stopping until he reached the front desk. His hand was shaking so badly that he could barely dial the phone. 911, he gasped into the receiver. There's something wrong at the Riverside Motel. Room 309. I think someone's been hurt. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Sir, I need you to stay on the line. Can you tell me what happened? Daniel's voice cracked. I don't know. I want to check on a guest. And the room was empty, but there's blood. There's blood coming from the bathroom. The dispatcher asked him to stay calm, to wait for the police to not go back into the room. Daniel agreed. But as he hung up the phone, his eyes drifted back toward the hallway, toward the door of room 309. And for just a moment, he thought he saw something. A shadow moving behind the door, a figure stepping out of the bathroom, disappearing into the darkness of the room. But when the police arrived 10 minutes later, room 309 was empty. The bathroom door was open. Inside, they found the body of a woman. She had been stabbed 16 times. But the most terrifying detail was something the coroner would discover later, something that would change the entire course of the investigation. The woman had been dead for nearly 30 minutes before Daniel ever received the phone call, which meant only one thing. The person who called the front desk was not the victim. And whoever it was, they had been standing in room 309 with the body, listening, waiting, watching. Detective Mark Carver had been working homicide cases for nearly 18 years. He had seen bodies in alleys, in basements, in burned-out cars. He had seen murder scenes that made seasoned officers walk outside just to breathe. But the moment he stepped into room 309 at the Riverside Motel, something about the case felt wrong. Not just disturbing, wrong. The kind of wrong that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The crime scene was too clean, too quiet, too arranged. The victim lay in the bathroom, her body partially turned on its side against the cold tile floor. Blood had spread beneath her like a dark shadow, pooling around her head and shoulders. 16 stab wounds, but the strange thing was the lack of struggle. No broken furniture, no shattered glass, no overturned lamps. It looked almost as if the woman had been attacked suddenly, silently, and quickly. Carver crouched beside the bathroom doorway while the forensic team worked. Anything, he asked. Forensic technician Laura Bennett shook her head. No ID, no wallet, no purse. She lifted a small evidence bag. Just this. Inside the bag was a cheap motel key card. Room 309. That's it, Carver asked. Laura nodded. That's it. Carver frowned. People don't check into motels without luggage. They don't walk in with nothing but a key card and disappear. Someone had checked into this room. Someone had been here. Someone who had left no trace except a body and a phone call. The phone call. Carver walked out of the room and down to the motel's small security office, where another detective, Luis Ortega, was reviewing the recorded phone call. The motel's phone system automatically archived calls for billing purposes, and the recording was still intact. Play it again, Carver said. Ortega pressed the button. The recording crackled through the speakers. Daniel's voice first. Front desk. How can I help you? Then silence. Then the woman's whisper. Please help me. Then the breathing. The thud. The words. He said he'd come back. Then the chilling line. If the phone goes dead, it means he's here. Then the click. The room fell silent. Carver leaned against the desk, his mind racing. That's the same call Daniel described. Exactly the same. Ortega nodded. I know, but something's been bothering me. He rewound the tape, played it again, then paused it. Right there, right before she says he's here. Listen. They listened carefully. Faint, barely noticeable, but there. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Walking slowly across the motel room. And then a door creaking open. Ortega leaned back in his chair. Someone else was in that room during the call. Carver felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The killer. Ortega nodded. He was standing right there, listening, waiting, and when she said, if the phone goes dead, he hung up. He ended the call. Carver stared at the recording device. So the call wasn't a cry for help. It was a performance. He made her say those words. He made her read from script. Ortega's voice dropped, and he's been doing this before. The autopsy was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. Carver was in the observation room, watching through the glass as Dr. Patricia Harlow worked on the body. The woman was young, maybe mid-30s, with long dark hair and delicate features. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping. But Carver knew better. The wounds are consistent with a single weapon, Dr. Harlow said, her voice calm and professional. A knife with a narrow blade, probably a hunting knife or a large kitchen knife. 16 stab wounds, all concentrated in the chest and abdomen. Some are shallow, some are deep. The killer was methodical. He knew exactly where to strike. Carver leaned closer to the microphone. Any signs of a struggle? Dr. Harlow shook her head. No defensive wounds. No bruising on the hands or arms. She didn't fight back. Either she was taken by surprise, or she knew her attacker and didn't expect the violence. Carver frowned. What about the timing? The coroner's report said she was dead for 30 minutes before the call. Dr. Harlow nodded. That's correct. Based on the body temperature and the lividity, I'd estimate the time of death at approximately 11:15 p.m. The call was placed at 11:42. That had a gap of nearly 30 minutes. Carver leaned back. 30 minutes. The killer had stayed in the room for 30 minutes, moving around, setting up the scene, waiting. And then he had called the front desk, pretending to be the victim. It was theatrical. It was calculated. And it was terrifying. Anything else? Carver asked. Dr. Harlow hesitated. There's one thing. The victim's hands. They're clean. No dirt, no debris, no fibers. But she has faint calluses on her fingers, the kind you get from playing a stringed instrument. She was a musician, or at least she used to be. Carver made a note. No ID, no wallet. We don't even know her name. Dr. Harlow looked up at the observation window. There's one more thing, Detective. Something I found in her mouth. Carver's heart skipped. What? Dr. Harlow held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a piece of paper folded into a tiny square. It was yellowed and old, the edges frayed. I found it tucked under her tongue, Dr. Harlow said. It's a piece of paper, probably torn from notebook, and there's writing on it. A single word. Carver's hands tightened on the edge of the table. What does it say? Dr. Harlow carefully unfolded the paper and read it aloud. Remember, by the time Carver returned to the station, the case had already begun to spiral. The woman's fingerprints had been run through the national database, and there were no matches. No driver's license, no passport, no criminal record. It was as if she had never existed. But the word written on the paper, remember, gnawed at Carver's mind. It wasn't just a word. It was a message. A message from the killer to whoever found the body. A message that suggested this wasn't the first time. And then the second call came in. It was the following night, just past midnight. The night clerk at the Pinewood Motor Lodge, a small motel about 12 miles outside Millbrook, received a phone call. A woman's voice, soft and trembling, asking for help. The same words, the same tone, the same chilling sentence. If the phone goes dead, it means he's here. Carver and Ortega were on the scene within minutes. The Pinewood Motor Lodge was even smaller than the Riverside Motel, a rundown roadside stop with flickering neon lights and a parking lot full of potholes. The night clerk, a young man named Ryan Harlow, was pale and shaking when they arrived. It was the same thing, Ryan stammered. Exactly the same thing. The same words. The same voice. I recognized it from the news. Carver's jaw tightened. What room? Ryan swallowed hard. 214. Carver and Ortega exchanged a look. The number was different, but the pattern was the same. A motel room, a phone call, a woman's voice, and a body waiting to be found. They rushed to room 214. The door was locked, and Ryan was too frightened to open it. Carver had to use his shoulder to break it down. Inside, the room was exactly like the one at the Riverside Motel. The bed was perfectly made. The television was playing softly. The bathroom door was slightly open, and beneath it, blood was spreading across the tile floor. Carver pushed the bathroom door open. Another woman, another body, another 16 stab wounds. But this time there was something different. On the bathroom mirror, written in what appeared to be lipstick, was a single word. Remember. Carver and Ortega spent the rest of the night at the Pinewood Motor Lodge, watching as the forensic team worked their way through the room. The second victim was similar to the first. Young, dark-haired, no ID, no wallet, no fingerprints in the system. But there were differences, too. The second victim had a small tattoo on her wrist, a flower that Carver recognized as a forget-me-not. And she was wearing a necklace, a simple silver chain with a tiny charm. The charm was a key. Carver examined the key closely. It was old, tarnished, the metal worn smooth by years of handling. There was a number engraved on it, tiny and barely visible. 309. Carver's blood ran cold. The key was for room 309, the room where the first victim had been found. "You see this?" he asked Ortega, holding up the key. Ortega studied it, his face pale. "He's connecting them. The victims. The rooms. He's leaving a trail." Carver nodded. "He wants us to know they're connected. He wants us to see the pattern." But what is the pattern? The answer came the next morning when Carver received a call from the state crime lab. They had matched the fingerprints of the first victim to a missing persons report filed in 1998. The woman's name was Emma Sinclair. She had disappeared from a small town in Oregon, leaving behind a husband and 2 children. She had been missing for nearly 15 years. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was that Emma Sinclair was listed as deceased. Her body had never been found, but she had been declared dead in 2003 after years of searching. And now, here she was dead again in a motel room in Millbrook. Carver felt the room spinning around him. Emma Sinclair had been missing for 15 years. She had been declared dead, and then she had turned up in a motel room, stabbed 16 times, wearing the same wedding dress as a woman who had died nearly a century ago. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But then Carver remembered the word on the mirror. Remember. And he realized that the killer wasn't just leaving a message. He was telling a story that had been unfolding for years, maybe decades. A story that was waiting for someone to find the missing pieces. Carver began to dig into the history of the Riverside Motel. He searched property records, newspaper archives, and old police reports. What he found was a pattern that stretched back nearly 50 years. The Riverside Motel had been built in 1972, but the land it sat on had a much older history. In the 1920s, the property had been home to a small boarding house run by a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. The boarding house had a reputation for being a place where people went to disappear. It was said that Eleanor took in runaways, abused women, and others who had nowhere else to go. But some people said she did more than just take them in. Some people said she made sure they never left. In 1929, the boarding house burned to the ground. Eleanor Whitmore was found dead in the ashes. Her body burned beyond recognition. But there were rumors that she hadn't died in the fire. There were rumors that she had escaped, that she had started a new life somewhere else, that she was still out there, still taking in people who had nowhere else to go. Carver didn't believe in rumors, but he couldn't ignore the pattern. Emma Sinclair had disappeared in Oregon in 1998. The first victim had been found at the Riverside Motel, which was built on the site of Eleanor Whitmore's boarding house. The second victim had been found at the Pinewood Motor Lodge, another motel with a similar history. There was a thread connecting all of it, a thread that led back to Eleanor Whitmore. But Eleanor Whitmore had died in 1929. She couldn't be the killer, unless... Carver's mind raced. Unless the killer wasn't Eleanor Whitmore herself. Unless the killer was someone who had inherited her legacy, someone who had taken up her work and carried it on for decades, someone who was still out there, adding to the collection. The third call came 3 nights later. This time, it was from the Maple Creek Inn, a motel 20 miles north of Millbrook. The same voice, the same words, the same chilling line. "If the phone goes dead, it means he's here." Carver and Ortega arrived at the Maple Creek Inn to find the night clerk, a young woman named Sarah Kim, standing in the lobby, her face pale and her hands trembling. "It was the same," she said. "Exactly the same. I heard on the news, and when the call came in, I knew it was the same thing." Carver's heart pounded. "What room?" Sarah swallowed hard. 309. Carver felt the world tilt beneath him. Room 309. The same number as the first motel. The killer was repeating the pattern, cycling through the numbers, creating a loop. But there was something different this time. When Carver and Ortega reached room 309, they found the door slightly open. The television was playing softly inside. The bed was perfectly made, and there was a phone on the nightstand, off the hook. But there was no body. The room was empty. Ortega frowned. "Where's the victim?" Carver walked slowly through the room, his eyes scanning every corner. Then he noticed something on the bathroom mirror. Another word, written in lipstick. "Listen," and beneath it, a phone number. Carver stared at the phone number for a long moment. Every instinct told him not to call it. Every instinct told him it was a trap, that the killer was waiting for him to make that call, to follow the trail deeper into the darkness. But he had no choice. He had to follow the trail. He had to find the missing piece. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, soft and calm, completely different from the terrified whispers on the recorded calls. "Hello, detective." Carver's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The woman chuckled softly. "You've been following my trail. You've been finding my pieces. You've been reading my story." Carver's heart pounded. "You're the killer. You're the one who's been taking those women." The woman's voice was serene. "I'm the one who's been collecting them, preserving them, making sure they're not forgotten." Carver felt a cold rage building in his chest. "They're not collections. They're people. You murdered them." The woman sighed. "I gave them meaning. I gave them purpose. They were lost, forgotten, abandoned. I made sure they would be remembered." Carver's voice was shaking. "Where are they? Where are the bodies?" The woman paused. Then she said something that made Carver's blood run cold. "They're where they've always been. In the rooms, in the walls, in the floors. The motels are built on them, detective. Every room, every hallway, every foundation. They're all part of the story." Carver felt the world spin around him. "You're insane." The woman's voice was gentle. "No, detective. I'm a historian. I'm the keeper of the memories. And now that you've found me, you're part of the story too." The line went dead. Carver spent the next 48 hours coordinating a massive search of the Riverside Motel and the Pinewood Motor Lodge. He ordered ground-penetrating radar to be brought in, and he had forensic teams tear up the floors and walls of every room that had ever been connected to the case. What they found was beyond anything he could have imagined. Beneath the floors of room 309 at the Riverside Motel, they found the skeletal remains of 3 women. They had been buried in the foundation, their bodies preserved by the concrete and the cold. Each one was wearing a piece of jewelry, a necklace or a bracelet, and each one had a note tucked into their clothing. Remember, beneath the floor of room 214 at the Pinewood Motor Lodge, they found another 2 bodies. And beneath the floor of room 309 at the Maple Creek Inn, they found another. In total, they found 7 bodies. 7 women who had disappeared over the past 30 years. 7 women who had been forgotten by the world. 7 women who had been preserved, collected, and hidden in the very walls of the motels where they had been killed. Carver stood in the parking lot of the Riverside Motel, watching as the forensic teams carried out the remains. He had been a detective for 18 years, and he had seen some terrible things. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The killer had been operating for decades, taking women who had no one to look for them, hiding their bodies in the foundations of motels, and leaving behind nothing but a phone call and a word. Remember. But why? Why had she done it? Why had she gone to all this trouble? The answer came when Carver received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from a small town in Oregon, the same town where Emma Sinclair had disappeared. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, faded, the edges curled. It showed a young woman, dark-haired and beautiful, standing in front of a boarding house. On the back, written in elegant script, was a name. Eleanor Whitmore, 1928. And beneath the name, a message. "Remember me." Carver flew to Oregon the next day. He tracked down the old boarding house, or what was left of it. The building had been demolished years ago, replaced by a strip mall. But the land was still there, and the stories were still alive. He found an elderly woman who had lived in the town for most of her life. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she remembered Eleanor Whitmore. She was a strange woman, Margaret said, her voice trembling. She took in all kinds of people, runaways, drunks, women who had nowhere else to go. But not all of them left. Some of them just disappeared. Carver leaned forward. What happened to them? Margaret shook her head. No one knew. There were rumors, of course. People said she killed them. People said she buried them in the basement. But no one ever proved anything. And then the boarding house burned down, and Eleanor was gone. Carver felt a chill run down his spine. Gone? You mean she died? Margaret hesitated. I don't know. They found a body in the ashes, but no one was ever sure it was her. Some people said she escaped. Some people said she changed her name and started over. But I always wondered if she was still out there. Carver felt the pieces falling into place. Eleanor Whitmore hadn't died in the fire. She had escaped, and she had started a new life, continuing her work, taking in women who had no one else, and hiding their bodies in the foundations of motels. But that was nearly 80 years ago. Eleanor Whitmore would be over 100 years old if she were still alive. She couldn't be the killer. Unless... Carver's mind raced. Unless the killer wasn't Eleanor Whitmore herself. Unless the killer was someone who had inherited her legacy. Someone who had been raised to continue her work. He asked Margaret if Eleanor had any children. Margaret's face went pale. She had a daughter, she whispered. A little girl. She was born in 1929, just before the fire. No one ever knew what happened to her. Some people said she died in the fire. But I always wondered. Carver's heart pounded. What did you wonder? Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. I wondered if she survived. I wondered if she grew up. I wondered if she knew what her mother had done. And then Carver realized the truth. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer wasn't a copycat. The killer was Eleanor Whitmore's daughter. A woman who had been raised in the shadow of her mother's crimes, who had been taught to carry on her work, who had been collecting women for decades, hiding them in the foundations of motels, and leaving behind nothing but a phone call and a word. Remember, Carver tracked down the killer through a series of property records and old newspaper clippings. Her name was Victoria Whitmore, and she was living in a small house on the outskirts of Millbrook, just a few miles from the Riverside Motel. She was in her late 70s, a frail-looking woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a serial killer who had been operating for decades. But when Carver showed up at her door with a search warrant, she didn't try to run. She didn't try to hide. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting him. I knew you would find me eventually, she said quietly. I knew the story would come full circle. Carver's voice was cold. You killed those women. You took them from their families and hid their bodies in motel foundations. What? Victoria's eyes were distant. My mother taught me that some people are forgotten, the lost, the lonely, the abandoned. She said it was our duty to remember them, to preserve them, to make sure they were never truly gone. Carver shook his head. You didn't preserve them. You murdered them. Victoria smiled faintly. I gave them a home. I gave them a place where they would never be forgotten. They're in the walls, detective. They're in the foundations. They're part of the story now. Carver felt a wave of nausea wash over him. You're insane. Victoria's eyes met his. No, detective. I'm the historian. And you're the one who will remember. Victoria Whitmore was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial was a sensation, drawing attention from all over the country. The evidence was overwhelming, the bodies, the phone calls, the letters. Victoria was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But even after she was behind bars, the story continued to haunt Millbrook. The motels were demolished, the bodies exhumed and given proper burials. The families of the victims finally had closure, but the wounds would never fully heal. Detective Mark Carver retired from the force a few years later. He moved to a small town on the coast, where he lived a quiet life, far away from the horrors of the case. But he never forgot the women in the walls, the forgotten ones, the ones who had been preserved in concrete and silence. He never forgot the word. Remember. But even after the trial, even after Victoria Whitmore was sentenced to life in prison, the story refused to die. People in Millbrook still whispered about the motels, about the phone calls, about the women in the walls. Some said they could still hear the voices, faint and distant, crying out for help in the dead of night. Others claimed they saw lights flickering in the windows of the demolished motels, even though the buildings had been torn down years ago. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind was just right, People passing by the empty lots where the motels once stood would hear a phone ringing. A single, insistent ring, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And if they were brave enough to answer, they would hear a woman's voice, soft and trembling, asking for help. "Please, help me." And then the line would go dead. Tonight's story ends here, but the echoes of room 309 will linger in your thoughts, drifting softly as you drift into sleep. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the rain carry your worries away. The darkness is safe. The world outside can wait. If this story helped you relax, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. Every new episode arrives every night, waiting to help you find peace. Sleep well. You are safe. Good night.